We have been in a many-week study, and many of those weeks we weren't physically meeting, but we had a few where we were talking about observation. We spent a long time talking about observation, and so that took us to a place where we finally felt like we had a little bit of handle on what was going on, and so now we're ready to begin to think about how to put the pieces together. And we said, you got to keep the order right, because first you figure out what you have, then you figure out what it means. And that is a frightening thing for many people, because many have just learned bad habits and so forth, that you just read a passage and everybody spouts off what they think about it, and which is not exactly how Bible study was meant to be done. And so there's a place for that after you've studied it, but not just having it hit you cold. So I want to talk a little bit about how we just get into the business of Bible study. And we said the first thing is we went back to the observation phase, and we said we've got to think about context. We study our context, and we find out, among other things, that there were so many things to keep track of that you almost need a big list to keep everything straight. And that doesn't mean that we have to do every one of them every time, but there are a lot of things to keep in mind in our tool bag. And so we begin thinking about it. So we are thinking about, where is this thing occurring? We ask all those questions: who's speaking, who's being spoken to. We begin to put the pieces together, what's in the verse to the left and the right, and we read a whole paragraph and we read a whole book if we can, and we don't just take things out of context. But there are other kinds of context as well, and we talked about comparison. And so now we're saying, let's compare one passage to what we read in another passage. In other words, God inspired the whole Bible. And if he inspired the whole Bible, we shouldn't assume that he's just sort of haphazardless, throwing things out. I always think of Proverbs 26, when you read about answering a fool according to his folly, and then not answering a fool according to his folly. You might say, well, apparently he forgot where he was. But those get sandwiched right next to each other in Proverbs 26. And so what does that mean? It means he knew exactly what he was saying. And he's saying, the way I like to look at it, basically there's no winning. If you're talking to a fool, there's no winning. They're going to, if you say anything back to them, they're going to think, you've become just like them, and you've got caught up in this thing. And if you don't say anything, they're going to think, well, see, I just won the argument. And so there's no winning. And so that's the bottom line there. But we want to compare things, and sometimes a word will mean something by one writer, and it won't mean exactly the same thing in another context. And so we have to be careful of things like word studies, but comparison is very useful, and we'll come back and think about that in a couple minutes. The other is cultural and historical background. In other words, there's a historical context and a cultural context that we need to think about. Right now, I was listening to about an hour today from the president of the Founders Ministries on the whole fight that's going on in Southern Baptist circles. Last year, this time, it was going on about the whole business of complementarian theology, meaning that men have certain roles and women have certain roles, and you have people who go off the deep end in these areas, and some would say women are clearly not meant to ever have anything to say. They're not meant to speak in our services, and that completely conflicts with what you read in 1 Corinthians 11. But then you have others who say it's all a cultural thing because of the things that were going on back then in the environment they had, the Greek culture, Roman culture, Jewish culture, and it doesn't fly today. And so one guy got up and said, the reason the Southern Baptists are going through all these difficulties and dealing with sexual abuse cases is because it's the judgment of God, because guess what? They aren't letting women preach, and be pastors of their churches. And then he said, we send people to other parts of the world, to Africa and Asia, and as missionaries, and they start churches, they plant churches, they design services, they teach men, and then we'd think nothing of it. And actually, it is in fact not true at all, because we don't do any of those things. If you ask the IMB, they'll tell you we train women to go, and they usually go with the men, or they're doing, as our example that we had a few months ago, when we had one of our ladies come in and speak to us about her ministry in a particular area in Asia. She's in charge of a girls' school, and she's ministering to the girls there. She is not a pastor of a church, and she's not planting a church. So you can make those kind of statements and make the statement that it's all a cultural thing, but it's just not true. And the fact is, if it says it in black and white in the Bible, I don't have the authority to change that. There may be cultural issues, and we may be able to look at those kinds of things. That particular passage, if you're thinking of what Paul writes to Timothy in chapter 2, 1 Timothy, he specifically ties it to Adam and Eve and the order of creation. In other words, if I can't go back and change the order of creation, I can't change the argument that he was making. So that's a way of evaluating and sort of cutting through. Are we talking about a cultural situation, or are we talking about something that's going to stand no matter what your culture? Phrases that we use are very similar as well. Today it was raining cats and dogs for a while out there. And if you thought about if that was written in the Bible and you tried to translate it, and then we tried to read it 4,000 years later or something, we would say, why, that's preposterous. You'd have people, atheists and so forth, going around saying, well, good and well, these people were, suffering from all these superstitions, and never in the history of the world have the clouds opened up and cats and dogs fallen from the sky. And that's not what they meant. That's not what we mean when we say that. And so we have to think of the cultural situation and the historical background. What came before what, and what came after what, and why, and what was the response. So now we're to another category, and that is consultation. Now, some of us have had situations where we've had to work on particular kinds of things, and we've just made do. I've told the story many times when I was in junior high or high school. I don't remember which, might have been ninth grade, I don't know. And our vocational agriculture teacher, I got to tell you what it was like in class. We welded up projects, and then sometimes the next hour of kids would come in, and sometimes they'd take a cutting torch and cut your projects all to pieces, that kind of thing. And the teacher was not always paying any attention. He'd just go sit in his office and smoke cigarettes and drink Pepsi, and then occasionally he would lecture. But one thing that he taught us that has stuck with me all these years, so he was a good teacher when he was teaching, he said, listen, if you need to beat on something, go back and get the big screwdriver. And that was his little joke to make it clear to us, if you need a hammer on something, please go get a hammer. Don't use something else that's laying around in the shop. And so he made a joke about it, but it's true. And, sometimes we've been up here working on things. Brother Doug has a lengthy experience of dealing with more intricate work. And he has a few tools laying around. And sometimes he'll just say, no, I'll go home and get whatever it is. And then he comes back a little while later and he brings whatever it is. And then he gets the job done faster than if he had just played around with whatever he had on hand or whatever I found in my toolbox. That's the importance of having the right tools. And we need an assortment of tools as well. If you've ever been on one of our men's mission trips, as Brother Ross has seen, we haul one of everything with us. And then usually it gets used. That's kind of the way it is. And it's necessary sometimes. So what do you need for a good Bible study? And that's why this is a little different kind of a lesson than some. You need a good study Bible. Now that sounds immediately, I'm thinking, when you say that kind of thing, that a lot of people would think, I traded this Bible, for instance, the Life Application Study Bible, New Living Translation, because I was reading the New Living at the time, and Bill Leonard had this at home that he got cheap someplace, and it's a very nice Bible. I mean, it's got notes and it's got all kinds of things. There have been many good study Bibles like this and full of all kinds of cool tools and pictures and explanations. But the thing is, and I traded him because I had, I don't know what the name of it was. It should be something like enormous print. It was much bigger than giant print, and the thing was about this tall and this wide, and probably bigger than that. And it was New King James, which he was looking for, and it was big enough for him to be able to read. It was a monster, and not the kind of thing I would ever be able to carry into the pulpit without a wheelbarrow, but it's something that you could have at home. And that was actually a much better choice of a study Bible. Because a study Bible, ideally, you'd have big enough print to be able to read. You'd have a lot of white space, preferably wide margins, that kind of thing. And not many notes to distract you, because remember, the notes are not the inspired part. I brought a Legacy Study Bible. Hank Hanegraaff put this out some years ago. This would be what you would call a study Bible. See the size of the margins? You could write in there, and you should keep notes on things that you've been studying. And if you get it so messed up that you can't stand it, you get another one in a few years. And after you've done that, you can look back and see the things that you've done over time. Now, I do not personally write much in mine because mine usually go to the pulpit, and I don't even want my notes written all over the place, because I need to be able to look down and see that thing and just see the text and be able to read it off. That's why I tend to use very large print, what they now call giant print, and because large print is not large at all. And so that's what you need, something that you can keep track of. It works just as well to have a notebook or something next to it, but maybe not as convenient. We have talked also about concordances. This is a Young's, and there's also a Cruden's. I told you the little story Jay Adams used to say, you need a Strong's Concordance for strong Christians, and a Young Concordance for young Christians, and a Cruden's Concordance for crude Christians. And so we could probably pass a few of them out in our church. But here's a Strong's, and so what can you do with a concordance? I'm going to be brief, because the truth is, if you've got access to a computer, most of the time they'll have all this stuff built in. You can have more power Might have to get another one, I don't know. So that's why we don't use this one upstairs anymore. So in the front end of this, it has what they call the main concordance. It just takes you through words, and you can look these things up, and they have a number associated with them. Either it's an H number or a G number, and you can look it up and find it in the back. You can look up that number and find the word and get a little description from the word. Nowadays, these things are usually tied to the biblical text in many of the tools that we use, and I'll show you some of those in a little bit, which makes it easy. The nice thing about that is it's also tied to a lot of other pieces of study equipment, so that those strong numbers have sort of become the standard, by which people refer to this or that or another term. Because you can have lots of terms that get translated into similar sounding English words, and they mean different things. We have to be careful about using those. So concordances are nice. They're tied to the Greek or the Hebrew. I will show you, just so we get a little chance to look at it here. Here, this is not Strong's, but this is an example from the Logos web app. Logos, if you look up Logos on your browser, it's got a free package that includes quite a few nice things, and of course they want to sell you lots and lots of things that could cost you thousands of dollars. Olive Tree is another one. There's an online Bible that's inexpensive. Lifeway has a thing called the Word Search Bible, and it has a number of free kinds of tools as well. I know some of our folks, like Brother Calvin, has had macular degeneration problem for years, and he uses computer-based text to read because he can change the size of the text, and that makes it a lot easier to be able to see. And my mom used to try and do the same thing. Same is true with audio recordings and things like that. A little harder to navigate in an audio recording versus being able to scoot around like that, but it's a nice thing. And then you can usually, in Logos, you could click on a particular term, and as I did here, I clicked on breastpiece and then brought up this breastpiece, and it gives you a word, it gives you a description, and it tells you some other places where you can go and find information about it. I use that example so that we can go on and look at some other kinds of things. Set my Bible down here. This pile, I have Bible dictionaries. This is an old one. You can tell just from looking at it. And here's Vine's Expository Dictionary of Biblical Words. There are some new ones, and in fact, the Holman Bible Dictionary, there's both dictionaries and encyclopedias are useful. This particular one comes from Holman, and it's got lots of fancy pictures, it's got descriptions of things. It's just going to be alphabetical, just like a dictionary would or an encyclopedia, and then you could look up particular issues that you were interested in. For instance, I put a little marker here on the ephod, a priestly garment connected with seeking a word from God and used in a wrong way as an idol. And then it has a whole discussion there. You would read about it in Exodus 25, 28, 29, 35, and on, and still was around in David's day. And then you find out that it had the breastpiece that was worn over it, and then the breastpiece had, rows of jewels that were on it that represented the different tribes of Israel. And you even see that reflected all the way at the end of the Bible when you get to Revelation 21, and you see those foundations And there are 12 of them. How about that for a number? And each one's out of a different one of these stones. And so it's very interesting. These are interesting reading. They're not going to maybe touch on everything. They can't because they're only so big. But they will give you a lot of information. There are, like Zondervan and ISBE, have 5-volume encyclopedias that are quite a bit bigger. And Freddie could tell you when he's had to write things in the past, sometimes I would tell him, go look it up in that Zondervan encyclopedia. Well, here's the thing. What's the difference between, why would they keep coming out with new ones? Because they can sell them. No, that's part of it. But the other reason is, especially in the last, let's say 100, even in the last 40, 50 years, we have made some pretty outstanding archaeological discoveries. And so a newer version, both archaeological studies and even some of the linguistic studies, the newer ones are going to have some things that the older ones did not have access to, which is sort of a little statement to us how much we owe to all the folks who have come before us, because we just keep building upon what we already have. And we've got the ability to look things up that people would have absolutely, well, if they were Christians, they probably wouldn't have killed for it, but everything short of that. That is different from the next thing that is also quite useful, and that is something like a Bible handbook. When we say handbook, we usually mean something that sort of goes through the Bibles in Bible book order. So they would have something to say about every book of the Bible, possibly every chapter, maybe not getting into all the fine points. This particular one is Talk Through the Bible by Bruce Wilkinson and Ken Boa from the Walk Through the Bible Ministries. It's a good example, and if you make your way through, if you remember us working on some of the tabulated data, you'll see that's a big part of what you see in here. It just allows you to quickly take a look at what's going on in a book and sort of get a handle on it. And then you'll see information, in this case, an introduction and title and author, and just a lot of basic information. And then there'll be subsets of those drawings, and then sort of a little outline of what the book covers. Then you're on to the next book. That's kind of the way it goes. Doesn't spend a whole lot of time in each one, because you got 66 of them to fit in this one volume, but goes through in book order, so it's pretty easy once you learn where the books are, how to find things. This is sort of in between, but this is a Tyndale Handbook of Bible Charts and Maps. Lots of charts, lots of maps, lots of descriptions of things put in tabular order, so it's easy to look these things up. This particular one came out with a disk so that you could load it on your computer and just pull that stuff up, which means if you've got it off-site someplace and didn't lug your book around, but did have your computer, you just search for the thing and you could have it pop right up and look at it. Be good for teaching the class and showing the class too. That leads us sort of halfway into the next category, and that is things that are going to help us with history or geography. This particular one is the New Manners and Customs of Bible Times. So what would I find in here? I'll just read you some of the contents. It begins here, the individual and family life. So on page 12, clothing. Want to know what people wore and when they wore it and what it looked like and how it worked. Dwellings, domestic activities, food and meals, family, education, earning a living, agriculture, earning a living, collecting food, earning a living, shepherding, that kind of stuff. Just everyday life, because things are not exactly the same as they were 2,000 years ago. And actually, if you think about it, most of us, besides Freddie, and he might have been forced to learn a few of these things, we were around at a time when things were a little different, you know. When we moved out to the farm, we didn't have electricity going. We didn't have running water going up to the house. We still had an outhouse. And just, I mean, a lot of folks, you know, from my era and back, we didn't live dramatically different lives from, especially if you were out in the country, from ancient peoples. But anymore, you know, everything's so driven by concrete and steel and electric wires and televisions and so forth that it's becoming harder and harder for people to even grasp what this stuff was about. That's where this kind of stuff can really be helpful. Even if you did, if you grew up around here, it means you probably did not grow up across over in the Near East and so forth. And so this is the Moody Atlas of Bible lands, and there are other atlases. Usually Bibles will have some maps and so forth. This is a whole group of them. Discusses even things. I mean, I did not pick this particular page on purpose. The only highlighted section on this page is hydrology. Okay, where else are you going to learn about the hydrology of a particular area in biblical lands? The mountains and rivers of Palestine, and I mean political boundaries, physical topography, and a lot of those kinds of things. So that's an important element of understanding some of the way things are written and the way they describe things in the Bible. Then we get to probably the most commonly looked at Bible study tools, and that would be the commentaries. This particular one, the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Frank Abeline, there are 12 of these, and they are very good. You can't have 12 volumes and write about every word in the Bible. So in general, they're geared toward tough areas, you know, areas where you would have a question. If it's like A plus B equals C and that kind of thing, the dog trotted down the road, probably don't need an explanation of that. But if it's a complicated issue and people are going to have questions, that's the kind of stuff that goes into these commentaries, and there are all different kinds of them. Some you almost have to be able to read Greek and Hebrew because it'll be so full of it that you won't be able to get around. That's not the way this particular series is, but if you do read, you'll gain a little extra information there. That's where your concordance is going to be tied to those words and help you quite a bit. So that's in a big series. There are others. For instance, here's a Tyndale series where they come out book by book. So this small volume, that's 1 Corinthians. So this is going to be less to say about some passages, and it's going to really emphasize the tough ones, the complicated ones, which can be good. Then you have other kinds. I brought in a couple of examples. Here's 1 Corinthians from John MacArthur. Compare that to the one that you just saw. And here's the gospel, volume 1 of the Gospel of Matthew, and by James Boyce. Now, what's the difference between these and these guys? These are preachers. And so basically, this is putting all their sermon notes for going through a series together and editing them down so that they become a very easy to sit down and read through, just like you're listening to a sermon. I know I probably just said something that is bouncing off your ears wrong, because you're thinking, what? You think listening to a sermon is easy? Well, okay. Easier than reading the technical manuals, okay? Because this is going to sound like a story that goes from beginning to end and has, points A, B, C, and D and that kind of thing. So if you like that kind of thing, there's a lot to be gained, and they will have already gone through a lot of these before they ever write their sermons. But they're not bound to tell you about all of it because they were written in a sermon format. Then, because everybody can't afford everything, you have to start with something simple. This is the old teacher's commentary by Paschal and Hobbes. Remember Herschel Hobbes? And so this is just one volume to take you through the whole Bible. There are also some like the Bible Knowledge Commentary at Dallas Seminary. That's a 2-volume, just an Old Testament and New Testament. Then you have some like this one, Prayer, Praise, and Promises by Warren Wiersbe. This goes through the whole book of Psalms, but it's more written as a devotional. So it just got, some of the Psalms has got to break up into pieces, but it'll have like a devotional reading for that hunk of Psalms until it takes you through all 150 Psalms. And so that's another style of commentary. And you got to think about what it is that you're getting this commentary to do. I think it's interesting. We got at the We Preach Christ conference, which will be at Delisue again in August, middle of August. I don't remember exactly, 15, 19, something like that. But we'll be talking about it when we get close. This is a book by David Allen, an annotated survey of commentaries and preaching resources for every book of the Bible. This is meant for preachers and teachers and has the best available scholarly help for all these different books of the Bible. So that's all this is a list of other books. So it'll have like exegetical commentaries like these, the expository commentaries, more like these, and it'll have special studies. I saw several other categories, devotional commentaries, whatever might be available for that particular thing. Here's one that just has sermons that cover this material. So kind of a cool little thing. They gave it to us free while we were there at the We Preach Christ conference. And if you're a pastor, it's nice to leaf through and say, if I'm going to spend X amount of money on books, I'd like it to be the right one. And now that it's so hard to get your hands on materials to look at, our seminaries don't have bookstores that you can go in and pick up the books and look at anymore. And so many of our Christian bookstores have closed down. The other ones carry whatever's popular, which usually means name it and claim it and so forth. So what I'm saying is having a guide like that can be very useful because you only have so many dollars to spend on these things, even if you're fanatical about it like I am. And so you'd like it to be the good stuff. Okay.
What time I mentioned the Bible that I have now, and it has the notes, and you said at the beginning the notes are not inspired.
Right. I said it again today. I'm consistent.
But that isn't even.
No.
But you use those.
I will look at those, yes. But I'll tell you one thing that you should never, ever do, and that is open those things before you've studied the text. That's why we started with a real study Bible, meaning a Bible with no notes. We study that, and then when we have trouble understanding what those words are, or what in the world kind of weird thing is going on here, or I never heard of that kind of animal, or whatever it is, that's when we go to the other things. And we look at the maps, you know. Topography doesn't have to be inspired. It just is what it is.
But I have had Bibles with, no notes at all. And not until I got this Bible did I understand what I was reading, even though I've been in church all my life.
Well,
But I really, I went to a Christian college, and I had a really good study Bible, and I wrote all over it and made a mess. I was going to get it again, and I called the Bible bookstore up in New York, friends of ours, and she said it's like $300. But I didn't even understand it. This is a life application, something that you mentioned, but I didn't even understand some of the basics that I had read year after year after year until this explained it, and yet it's just by man. It's not inspired.
right?
But it certainly has gotten me from this point to this point.
Well, two things I'll say about that. One is, if you're looking at a map or something, that's certainly valid. If you're looking at somebody's interpretation of some portion of Scripture, why would I believe them? So, I don't know who these guys are, and so I would want to study it for myself. And on some of these, for instance, if you look on one of these pages, first of all, the text is very small, but then the other thing is, here's the text and here's the notes. In other words, you can barely get through the text for all the notes, and they're a distraction. And the Lord never said study all those other people's notes. He said we're to read the Bible, we're to hear the Bible, we're to speak it out loud to people and all those things.
I think this is why so many new Christians, I don't see, they say start reading the Bible, and if they're not nurtured by somebody or mentored by somebody.
Because that's the way it was supposed to be. They were supposed to be mentored by people.
Yeah, but we don't do that.
And it's supposed to be one-on-one instead of saying,
Churches don't do that.
get this bunch of notes. Well, we do as much as we're able and allowed to. I mean, it's a two-way street. So to mentor, you have to somebody who's going to give, and then somebody who's going to receive. And that is a necessity to make the whole marriage work.
Do you put any credence into, I guess that's the word, a study help written by a woman?
If she knows what she's doing. And how would I know? Because I read a lot of things. Yeah. One of the best Greek helps is a big fat book about like that, small to carry around, by Grosvenor and Zerwick. So Mary Grosvenor was the one who did most of the work for the Monsignor.
Does the seminary recommend these books?
These particular ones,
Well, something of the sort.
yeah, I'm sure some seminary does, just about all of them, because most of these guys are seminary profs. So,
And don't, I might be putting you on the spot, I don't know. Some ministers will read some other minister's sermons.
if somebody has some, I mean, you got to find one first of all, but
Well, Adrian Rogers.
I disagree with him on many areas, but he's a good speaker and good leader. I don't agree with anybody 100% except for the Lord. And he doesn't agree with me 100%. So,
I just don't see how you read
Well, most of it's just English. I mean, it is after it gets translated, it's just English. If you can translate an English sentence and understand what it means, break it down, that helps. I find that that's, I mean, we harped on that early on quite a bit, but that's half the problem. I've stood at the pulpit and read verses and had people disagree with me about them when it was written very plainly in black and white, and they've said it seems like it's saying just the opposite to me. And for me, it's not a, this is what I think. This is actually what it says. I mean, English is not necessarily an interpretive skill.
It just seems, even reading the Bible now, there seems to be some. Am I chasing you away?
No, but I have to.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
And
Contradictory, things, just like you were talking about the fools of Wicked, and they're not, because it's inspired by God. But it certainly seems like it. So how do you...
that's where we'll talk a little more about interpretation and get into figures of speech and that kind of thing. But you got to realize these folks are writing in a lot of ways very similar to the way we do. They have figures of speech. They have jokes. They have comparisons.
and that's why I think that our pastor up north gave, I think it was Hebrew, wasn't it? I think he taught a Hebrew class. And I know that if, they'll have in the notes, something, and you'll think, oh, now you understand because you understood the Hebrew or the Greek. I didn't understand that the Old Testament of the Bible was finally rewritten in Greek.
Mm-hmm. And it looked different from our Greek New Testament. It also looked different from the Hebrew Old Testament because they had a group of humans that got together and decided how to translate it. So, alrighty. The kids are done. Let's be dismissed. Lord, thank you for just the blessing to look into your scriptures. We know that we covered a wide swath today, a lot of different information, and we confess to you, Lord, that you alone are that final decision maker.